right? Now, the next thing to know, this is more for STAR, but it definitely will help you guys if you have to write about this stuff in AP. Here's some basic people that you guys need to know that could appear on your STAR test as well as on the AP test. Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson was a progressive president. He was technically a Democrat, but he followed the progressive views. He's the president that brings us the income tax. He's the president who creates the Federal Reserve Board. Now, remember, he had been, quote, a minority president. By that, I don't mean he's a minority. I mean, he got elected by a minimum, not minimum, but a non-majority of the population, kind of like Lincoln did in his first term. Why did that happen? Remember, Teddy Roosevelt had been out of the presidency for 4 years, but Teddy had gotten very, very nervous about what Taft was doing. He thought Taft was breaking up too many large corporations. He distrusted Taft on a lot of things, who'd been one of his best friends. And so Teddy decides to run. But the Republicans aren't going to dump their current, president, right? They've got a president sitting in the White House. And so the Republicans refuse to nominate Teddy. So Teddy, being Teddy, decides to create his own party called the Progressive Party, but everybody knows it as the Bull Moose Party. What does that do? That splits the Republican votes. I mean, imagine, y'all, if Biden and Sanders had both run as separate candidates against Trump. Trump would have won, right? Because the Democrats would have split their votes. Same thing basically happened, y'all, with Republicans in 1912. And so Wilson, y'all, becomes the only Democratic president after 1892 all the way until 1932, y'all, to get elected. And he would have never gotten elected had it not been for the split in the Republican Party. Now, he was very much an idealistic person. We also know now he was also very racist, even kind of by the standards of their time. I don't like to judge people by our standards. I don't think that's necessarily fair because I don't want to be judged by people's standards 100, 200 years from now. But even African Americans had a problem back then with this guy and some of his beliefs. He'd been raised a Southerner. He had good things to say about the Klan, for example. He allowed The Birth of Nation to be the first movie shown in the White House. And yet at the same time, he was a scholar. He was a college professor of Princeton, no less, y'all. And as an idealistic person who did try to look and think of government as absolutely good and could do great things for everybody, he really thought that he could convince Europeans who'd been killing each other for 2 or 3 years to have peace without victory. That basically he could talk the British and the French and the Germans to just all go home and shake hands and be buds again. I mean, it was very idealistic, and it's sad, y'all, but during a war, in some ways, the longer a war goes on, the harder it can be to get peace. Not because people aren't exhausted and want out of it, but because so much has already been lost. When you've lost millions of men and billions of dollars, you want something to show for it, for the loss of your blood and treasure. And the British and French were like, homie, don't play that. We're not going to do that. And so his attempt to get peace with victory was a failure. He even sent one of his best friends, a Texan by the name of Colonel House, Edward House. He sent him over to Europe to try to sit down with the British and the French and the Germans to bring about the end of the war. I say all this, y'all, because you kind of need to know of his idealism, right? This guy really thought, he could use his brain as a good progressive. He could use his brain to solve all the problems of the world. Now, in 1916, he runs again. And remember, he had really barely won in 1912. In 1916, it looks like he might be defeated by Charles Evans Hughes, a kind of moderate Republican. But his slogan is what won him the election. His slogan was, he kept us out of war, or he has kept us out of war. I actually have one of those pins somewhere. I never can find the stuff I need when I need it, but when I don't need it, it's always around. But anyway, this was what got him elected. Basically, he made it look like if you voted for the other guy, you'd be going to war. Nevertheless, even after he won this, and by the way, the election was so close. Close. Very good. Man, y'all learned. It was so close that Charles Evans Hughes went to bed thinking he had won. Wilson went to bed thinking he had lost and woke up in the morning to find out he had just got it by that much. Okay. Now, however, within 5 months of the election, April 1917, he does ask Congress to go to war. And you know, a lot of people accuse him of being sort of a hypocrite, like, oh, he gets reelected, so now he took us into war. Remember the events that happened, y'all. The Germans resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, which meant American ships were going to be sunk, American sailors and merchantmen were going to die. Also, remember the Zimmerman telegram comes out in February of 1917, which basically says, look, they're trying to get Mexico to attack us. So I really don't think he had any choice but to go and ask Congress. And remember, being this idealistic guy he was, this wasn't going to be a war about territorial gain or a war about, conquering, an enemy and getting revenge. It was a war to get rid of the tyranny and to make the world safe for democracy. Very idealistic guy in this case. And that's why before I knew about his racism, he was kind of a hero of mine in high school. Okay. Now, of course, knowing a lot of the other stuff about him, I still kind of admire his idealism. All of us, when we're young, should be kind of idealistic. Sadly, as you get older, you get kind of jaded and you don't have that idealism. But he still had it. He's also the author of the 14 Points, which he puts out in January of 1918 to basically tell the Germans, look, if you stop fighting now, this is going to be the basis of the peace treaty. And to the Germans, it seemed pretty fair, although they waited another 10 months before they finally did surrender. So Wilson, you should know that. The other thing about him, y'all, he is the father of this League of Nations. You can also say indirectly, he's the father of the United Nations. And literally, y'all, he will give up his life trying to get the American people to pressure their senators to vote for the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. How did he give up his life? He was traveling around the country, y'all, tirelessly campaigning for this. And in Pueblo, Colorado, he just fainted. He passed out. And shortly thereafter, he had a stroke. And he was never, ever able to talk or do much again for the last year of his presidency. And he died a broken man. So, he believed in it. He gave up everything for it. Okay, the next person we're going to look at, y'all, is definitely a person you guys need to know for star, and that is General John Pershing. If you guys remember when I was talking about Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, I might have mentioned Pershing. Pershing led a group of African-American soldiers, the so-called Buffalo Soldiers, in an attack as well, and he got the nickname Black Jack. Jack is short for John because, it saves a lot of time saying Jack instead of John. But anyway, he was known as Black Jack because he commanded African-American soldiers. But anyway, he becomes very, very famous, one of the most popular generals in American history during World War I. As I said, he fought in the Spanish-American War, okay? But he perhaps became most famous for his pursuit of Pancho Villa before America got into World War I. If you guys remember when we were talking about imperialism, Pancho Villa was a Mexican revolutionary, according to Mexicans, but according to Americans, he was a bandit and murderer, right? Different points of view, right? He crossed over into the United States, or his men had, I think he stayed on the other side, and attacked Columbus, New Mexico, killing some Americans. Also, he'd attacked a train carrying Americans that was traveling through Mexico. I think they were copper miners or something, and took them off the train and executed them. So as a result, the United States invaded northern Mexico and pursued him. They never caught him. It was very similar to our hunt for bin Laden, except fortunately we did get to bin Laden. We never got Pancho Villa. He ended up being killed by his own people. Now, in World War I, he's going to be the commander of the United States Army, what is called the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, right? Make sure you guys know that abbreviation and what it stands for.
This is like the British in World War I and in World War II. Their army they send to France will be known as the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force. So please remember the U.S. Army in World War I is known as the BEF. Now, American soldiers in World War II would be called GI Joes, all right, or GI, short for government issue, which was the GI, government issue, that was stamped on their stuff. But in World War I, they're called doughboys. There's a lot of possible reasons for them being called doughboys, partially maybe because they had all these webbings and belts and stuff that were sort of a doughish color. Some people say it was because when they were training and climbing through and going underneath wires and doing all that type of training, they got all dusty and they looked like kind of heavy doughboys. But anyway, do remember the name doughboys. That could come up on STAR, and it would be useful if you're writing a DBQ or LEQ and you're talking about American troops to know what that means. Now, American troops can really take a great deal of credit for winning this war. I see them almost, y'all, like two boxers have been going at it, for like 10, 12 rounds, and they're exhausted. And then like one of them steps out, tags an American, the American comes in and like, boom, one punch, knocks them out. We really only had troops there, y'all, in significant numbers, probably for about less than a year. And yet we turned the tide. We ended the stalemate of trench warfare. And we got there just in time. If you remember, in the Second Battle of the Marne and the Argonne Forest, which I'll mention here, I think, in a little bit, we literally stopped a massive German offensive called Operation Michael. They got really close to taking Paris, okay? Now, the next information is really more for STAR, but you definitely have to know this man's name and what he accomplished. The STAR test has kind of picked like one American hero from World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam conflict or Vietnam War, right? Alvin York is the guy. He's sort of sometimes called the reluctant hero because his religious faith told him not to fight, okay? He was a pacifist, or what he called, and today we would call, a conscientious objector, somebody who does not believe in fighting a war. They don't think it's right. And sometimes conscientious observers or objector status is accepted, and they might be given jobs where they don't have to fight. Maybe they're cooks or they're given some kind of duty, that kind of thing, where they're not involved in actual shooting and killing. But his status was rejected. I don't know exactly why, but it was. Now, here's a picture of Alvin York, okay? He's a good old country boy. I mean, literally. Now, he wins the Medal of Honor, which is the highest award our nation can give. They don't give this much, and they don't give it much to alive guys, right? Usually you get this posthumously, dead, because you did something so incredibly heroic, it took your life. But he survived this. And it's an amazing story. When I was in France a few years ago, I had a guide, a lady who'd written a lot of books on the subject, and we hired her. She was wonderful, and she took us, me and my friend Mel, all through the area. And so we went to where Alvin York won his Medal of Honor. There's a little notification there at a restaurant and there and everything. But anyway, what he did was he led an attack with a handful of men on a German machine gun nest. Now remember, the machine gun, it wasn't invented in World War I, but it really came of age, right? I mean, it just would gun down rows and rows of people, y'all, and of attacking soldiers. What he did was he attacked this machine gun nest. He captured 32 machine guns capable of killing hundreds and hundreds of Americans. He killed 28 German soldiers using his great shooting skills. As a country boy and, man who'd had to hunt turkeys and things to feed himself, he was a great shot. And he killed 28 soldiers, and he got 138 to surrender to him. He was shooting so effectively, y'all, they thought it must be a massive group of Americans who were doing this, okay? Now, this is part of what's known as the Meuse Argonne. That's A-R-G-O-N-N-E, argon like the gas, right, in chemistry. the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The Argonne is a forest, and the STAR test expects you guys to know what the forest, what the Argonne is. So this was part of America's offensive in the latter part of the war. Now what you see here, and this was the last major offensive of the war, but they made a movie about him starring the great Gary Cooper. You know, sadly, Alvin York kind of got in some trouble later on, and you know, not paying taxes or some kind of thing. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but he did make some money from the making of the movie, which I think helped him and helped get him some notoriety when the movie was made. I don't know, 20 or 30 years or so afterwards. But it tells his story, and of course, like a lot of movies, it's Hollywoodified and has some inaccuracies, but pretty decent. All right, y'all, the next thing I want to talk about is a famous group known as the Lost Battalion. A few years ago, an amazing movie came out. I say a few years ago, meaning like the 1990s, before your parents were probably met or whatever. But to Mr. D, that's like last week. But anyway, this is probably the most famous unit in World War I for the United States. I've already talked about our greatest hero, Alvin York, but this also features an amazing American hero as well, too. All right, now, what had happened was with this Lost Battalion, an American unit was ordered to attack. It had its target, and its objective, and it met it, right? Now, what happened, though, was a lot of the other units did not. So, you know, the other units, y'all, they're like, you know, here on the side, but this unit that would become known as the Lost Battalion marched and actually met its objectives, only to find itself that it was trapped behind the enemy lines. And, of course, the Germans, you know, went after it, and it almost was trapped for a whole week, you know, caught off, you know, with no food except what they carried, no ammunition except what they carried, and it was ruthlessly attacked. And it was called Lost because people didn't know where it was at the time. Now, enemy artillery attacked it, and also, y'all, even their own artillery attacked it. You know, they knew that there were soldiers there. And of course, the way these guns were, y'all, you fired them. It's called indirect fire. You fire from behind the scenes, you know, way behind the lines, and maybe miles away, a shell will hit you. So they were being killed by some of their own men. This is what we call friendly fire. Doesn't sound very friendly to me. I guess it's different than enemy fire. But they were being attacked by Germans and even American shells firing on them. So here you see a scene of that artillery coming in. This is from that movie. Now this is Colonel Whittlesby. Okay, I'll tell you a little bit more about his story here.
Must tell them to stop this, Jeremy.
Now, this is cher ami, which basically means dear one in French. They didn't have some required lines. And so people would use passenger pigeons or carrier pigeons. And these pigeons, you know, they knew where home was and they would fly back. You tie a tiny little message to his foot. And notice cher ami is flying back. Germans took shots at it and everything. Of course, it took it longer than that. But cher ami made it back, bless its little heart. Had a leg shot off, had an eye come out, was wounded. But it brought back a message and let the Americans know that the Germans weren't the only ones firing, but they were being hit by their own fire.
Cease fire! Right? Get me the artillery! Cease fire! That is an order! Cease fire!
So they did have phone lines, you know, by literally lines with artillery. And so there you see them firing the 75s. Those were called French 75s. So this little bird, y'all, saved a lot of American lives by letting them know to go ahead and stop firing. Okay. Now, to continue on, the carrier pigeon was named cher ami. It lost a leg, it lost an eye, it was wounded in the breast, and that little thing kept on going, y'all. Just another use of animals in the war. And it did stop the friendly fire. And after its death, this bird was stuffed and put on display. I don't know if it's on display anymore, but I remember seeing it and hearing the story first as a little kid. When we visited, I think it was at the Smithsonian, I was like in 4th or 5th grade and heard the story. Now, the bird did manage to survive, but sadly, when they pinned the metal onto its breast jaw, it died. It killed it. No. That was just a really bad joke, Mr. D. But there you see the medal that the bird received. Only time I know about a bird receiving a medal. All right. So yeah, there's the medal being pinned to the poor thing. Now, eventually they were rescued, but only a third of them remained alive as a result of this. Okay. Now, the commander of the unit, here he is, Charles Whittlesby, had been a lawyer. He kind of looks like John Lennon in this picture from, if you're a Beatles fan, John Lennon made a movie called How I Won the War. Kind of looks like John in that, but he was a successful Wall Street lawyer. And he got drafted or volunteered, I'm not exactly sure. But because of his education, he was made an officer, right? Which is always a good idea. Get educated and be an officer. Don't be an enlisted man or woman. That's tough. It's extra dangerous. But Whittlesby, y'all, a lot of them kind of laughed. What's a lawyer know about being this? And some of the professional officers kind of gave him a hard time and thought this man wouldn't have the guts. But boy, did he have the guts. He was the commander of the Lost Battalion. He kept his mind clear. He basically kept these guys together until they could eventually be rescued. And for his bravery, like Alvin York, he was given the Medal of Honor. Now, he returned back to the United States and tried to resume his practice in law, but he found it really hard to go back to normal, as many of our soldiers did. He said he was constantly getting phone calls or letters about the death, maybe suicide, of some of his former comrades in arms. People talk about this passenger that would be with them at all times. You and I might not see the passenger, but the passenger was their dead comrades wherever they went. When they sat at a dinner table and somebody wasn't there, people knew that there was a missing comrade there. And he was going to these funerals. He was visiting people all the time in hospitals, trying to do his best to help them recover, and of course maybe not taking care of his own post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is what he got. Once again, post-traumatic stress disease or disorder, as people call it, post-traumatic stress disorder or disease. Now, one day, and this may be in another video I included, he decided to take a cruise from New York City down to Cuba. Cuba was not communist yet in those days, and you could visit Cuba. And he set up, and he had some adult beverages, and I think he played cards and talked, and I don't know if he smoked a cigar or whatever, went back to his cabin. The next morning, people found all of his luggage all packed and sitting out. He had completed his will and done everything, but he was missing. And what it's believed happened is that this man, overcome by all the terrible things that he saw and still was having to face, took his own life by jumping off the ship. And thus we lost, of course, a famous and unbelievably brave American, an average American who rose to the occasion as so many Americans did and still do when our nation is challenged. And, you know, he's a hero of mine, so hopefully you guys don't mind learning about him.
A famous man sat up late drinking rum and talking with passengers on the deck of the SS Toloa, a ship bound for Havana, a favorite destination for rich American playboys looking for gambling, girls, and booze. The Williams College graduate and Harvard Law School educated New York lawyer was no playboy.
Now, I include this next clip, y'all, because often forgotten when we're concentrating on the men and women lost in war is the tremendous toll that war takes on animals. Since the beginning of war, animals have been victims in the war as well. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie called The War Horse, but it'll tear you up if you see it about a horse and what it goes through in the war. But it's just not horses, which were used, of course, to pull wagons, to pull artillery pieces. World War I was still very much a horse war in the sense of having to use horsepower to move things around. For the Germans and for the Russians, a lot in World War II, animals would still be used again. Even camels, y'all, were used a great deal in the fighting in the Middle East. But dogs were used. And this little video is going to give you guys a clip of kind of what happens with the animals, the millions that died in the war, you know, and you'll see some examples of dogs as well, too. There's Jeremy, or a pigeon anyway.
Cher
Look at a gas
Ami
mask on the...
wasn't the only heroic animal in the Great War. All kinds of animals were used in military operations throughout the conflict.
There's your camels.
Dogs were especially valuable as messengers.
Yeah, good old dog.
Trained dogs could find their ways through the maze of the trenches faster and safer than any human could. Their intelligence, courage, and loyalty also made them vital as first aid dogs. Many wounded men were saved by a Red Cross dog who carried them a canteen of water and alerted the stretcher bearers. Dogs were also used to pull machine guns and wagons up to the front lines. And a dog's love made life in the trenches just a bit more bearable. Many soldiers on all sides kept a dog. It could be said that the most famous dog to come out of the war was a puppy found among a pack of abandoned German war dogs, who would be later named Rin Tin Tin. Pigeons and dogs were important, but the vast majority of animals who were sacrificed for the war were horses and mules. It is estimated that more than 6 million horses served in the war, and the British recorded that about 800,000 of theirs were killed in action.
Just the British lost 800,000. But that's from a great show, y'all, called America in World War I that would be worth seeing if we had time, but of course we don't for these kind of things. Now, next I want to talk about an American writer that particularly is important to me. World War I inspired some amazing poetry, y'all. And this man's name was Alan Seeger. He's one of the great World War I poets. He'd been a poet before the war, you know, gone to college. And like a lot of Americans, when the war started, he wanted to do something, okay? He wanted to go fight for the French because the French had helped us in the Revolution. So he goes over and he serves with the French, you know, kind of like how I mentioned some others did that as well, too. And sorry for my phone going off there. But anyway, he he volunteered to fight for the French before we were even in the war. And he predicted his death. He wrote a poem called I Have a Rendezvous with Death. It was one of John F. Kennedy's favorite poems, appropriately, right? Because John F. Kennedy, of course, would have a rendezvous with death. He died on July 4th, 1916, a few days into the British and French battle called the Somme, as in S-O-M-M-E. Fortunately, I was able to be there on the 100th anniversary exactly of his death. And my friend and I went there and visited. Now, the French often did this when they couldn't really identify bodies, rather than just having like, known but to God or unknown soldier. They would kind of combine the bones of the dead, and they would just list the names of the people who were probably included there. And so that's what happened. They have a series of bones that are buried together in a mass grave, and his name is listed among them. And here is that. All these men were lost near here, okay? And his name is one of those, all right? And there he is, Alan Seeger. I took these pictures when visiting there in 2016, all righty? And so indulge Mr. D here while he shows you this poem here, because it is beautiful writing. I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. When spring comes back with rustling shade and apple blossoms fill the air, I have a rendezvous with death. When spring brings back blue days and fair, it may be he shall take my hand and lead me into his dark land and close my eyes and quench my breath. It may be I shall pass him still. I have a rendezvous with death on some scarred slope and battered hill. When spring comes round again this year and the first meadow flowers appear, God knows 'twere better to be deep pillowed in silk and scented down, where love throbs out in blissful sleep, pulse nigh to pulse and breath to breath, where hushed awakenings are dear. But I have a rendezvous with death at midnight in some flaming town, where spring trips north again this year, and I, to my pledged word am true, I shall not fail that rendezvous. And when we went to visit Seeger's grave, where he's buried somewhere in this, we brought a little cross that we planted there that the British do with the poppy on it. And here I read his poem right there, and it was very moving. Mr. D's being good and not tearing up here when I talk about it. But my friend Mel, Mel was a teacher friend with me. We taught for a lot of years together, and then we would travel together, and he was a big World War I buff as was I. And so we visited, and we were right there on the day. I mean, we hadn't planned it like that, but it just worked out. We wanted to be in Europe for the 100th anniversary of the Somme, but to literally be there on July 4th, 2016, when he fell, was an amazing stroke of luck and one of the highlights of my life. And I hope you guys will always try to realize your dreams and do those things while you can and are still young. My friend Mel sadly passed away a few years ago of cancer, but I'm glad he got to do it. I'm glad I got to do that with him, and I hope you guys will do that. Don't delay stuff, because things happen, all right? Now, next I want to talk about a man with a Houston connection. I think I know a lot about World War I, and boy, was I surprised to learn this information. But what had happened, y'all, was while I was in Ypres, right, visiting this lady and man who was in charge of this tank foundation to remember the first men to ever serve in tanks. I was a member of the organization. She was talking to us, and she said, hey, do you know who the first Texan to ever fall in the war was, or the first American? And I said, no, I mean, I wish I did. Or maybe she said first Texan. And I said, no, I don't. She goes, Dominic Naplava. I'm like, okay. And she goes, do you know where he was from? And I said, no, I don't. She's like, he was from Houston, or at least he had lived in Houston, right? And so we went to visit his grave. Now, he was a Czech immigrant. Now, you got to remember, Czechoslovakia wasn't yet a country. Czechoslovakia would become a country because of World War I. He was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he wanted to have a country. He was one of those nationalists that wanted the Czechs to have their own country. So to make that happen, he left Austria-Hungary, and he made his way to Houston, Texas, where he lived a brief while. Now, when the war started, he made his way up to Canada, in the midst of winter. I mean, Canada, I can tell you, is no fun in winter, And he joined the Canadian Army. Why the Canadian Army? Well, America wasn't in the war yet, and he wanted to do his part to try to help defeat the Germans and to defeat the Austro-Hungarians in hope that his country would be created. Sadly, he doesn't live to see that. Here is his grave, which we found. You notice the maple leaf, and there I am kind of pointing it out, and there you go. All right, good time, Mr. D. Okay, so we're looking at the armistice. Now, an armistice is not the same thing as a peace treaty, right? A peace treaty is where you sign a document and you agree on what you're going to do, each of you, to make sure there isn't another war, at least for a while. What an armistice does is you just stop fighting, right? You just agree to put down weapons. Now, the Germans had had several things happen. There had been an abdication, that is, the government had, or the Kaiser Wilhelm II, had actually quit, right? He'd abdicated his throne, and the new government, and this would curse the new government, y'all, the new government demanded and got a treaty. Now, or an armistice, which would ultimately result in the Treaty of Versailles. Now, a real problem, though, is this new government, because it was the one that surrendered, Hitler would blame them. In fact, he called them the November criminals. And he said that government had betrayed Germans. And there was another problem, too, y'all. Very little of Germany actually got invaded in World War I. So if I'm a German citizen and I'm sitting back in Berlin or Hanover and the war hasn't really come to me, I'm like, why did we surrender? And many Germans kind of had this feeling that they had never really lost the war. Okay, so an armistice was signed by the French, the Americans, the British, and the Germans in a railroad car in the Combien Forest. And a few years ago, my friend Mel and I, and Mel, you may have heard me mention before, he was a big World War I buff. He was a good old friend of mine, good teacher friend, who sadly passed away of cancer a few years ago. We went on this trip in 2016, and we visited a lot of these World War I sites. And we visited the Combien Forest. It's outside of Paris. The Germans got fairly close, y'all, to taking Paris. They would take it in World War II, but not in World War I. And this is the little clearing where they did it, and it's been preserved. Now, here you see a railroad car. Now, this isn't the actual railroad car, though, where the armistice was signed. What happened, y'all, was, this was really embarrassing for Germany to have to, sign an armistice. And so, get this, y'all, to show you how things can become symbolic. When Hitler took Paris and took France in World War II, Hitler had been in World War I, he had the French bring out the original railroad car where the Germans had surrendered, right? He had them bring out the original railroad car, and he made the French surrender to him there to kind of make up for the Germans having to surrender there 20 years before. Now, Hitler brought the railroad car back to Germany, right? And as the Allies were bombing and starting to take back Germany in World War II, Hitler got afraid, y'all, that the Allies might capture the railroad car and make the Germans sign a surrender in that same railroad car again. So under instructions from Hitler, the railroad car was blown up. However, some railroad cars from the same train did survive, and they redecorated this one to make you think it's the OG, the original railroad car. And here you can kind of see they have the rails preserved, y'all, where it actually happened. The Germans, y'all, they even went further. There had been a statue put there that had like the German eagle with a sword going through it, a French sword going through the German eagle. Hitler had that blown up. So it really kind of shows you, the anger that was between these two countries. All right, and here's my friend Mel standing in front of that train, and notice it has the colors of the various allies who were victorious. Now, as you guys will hear, this treaty will end up being quite mean, quite vindictive, and that's going to end up hurting the French later on. Now, the date of the armistice, I asked y'all about this. Okay, oops. All right. Oh, what the heck is that? Oh. Okay, y'all, so the war is going to come to an end at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. At the armistice meeting that I mentioned earlier, and I'll show you a picture of that on a train here, and after the abdication of the Kaiser, as I mentioned on the previous slide, Germany decides to seek an end to the fighting. And they agree that the fighting will stop the next day on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And it's just unfortunate they couldn't have started the war 7 years earlier, so it could have been the 11th hour of the 11th month of the 11th year. Why didn't they just go to 11 minutes and 11 seconds? But the thing is, y'all, people had almost a full day's notice that the war was coming to an end because they had to get word to everybody. And it's not like today where you could send a message out on a cell phone or something. You had to get to every unit. And sadly, y'all, some officers were still ordering attacks up to the last second. There were men killed within a few hours of the end of the war. And so that family members wouldn't understand and get upset about the waste of their husband, their son, their father, whatever, you don't see them listed, and families weren't told they died on the last day. They were told they died on November 10th. They even went so far as not to put it on tombstones. I learned this when I was touring the battlefields. A wonderful, wonderful lady, great writer about the French, and she was our tour guide for much of the area. My friend Mel and I hired her to take us around. She pointed that out to us, that you will not see this on any of the graves, because it was sad. But why would an officer do that? Well, they were wanting to win glory. They were wanting to win fame, maybe a promotion. So yeah, fighting continued up to the last second. Now, as I told y'all, an armistice does not end a war. An armistice just stops the fighting. You have to have a treaty. And of course, that is going to be the contentious Treaty of Versailles. Now, behind my picture here, you see a, of course, recreation of the signing of this, okay? I don't know, I can't remember now if I mentioned on the other slide, because I'm actually recording this at a little bit different time, but Adolf Hitler later had this train car blown up. He had it brought out of sort of retirement or from a museum so that he could get the French to sign a surrender that, to kind of make up for the Germans having to surrender in 1918. He made the French sign a surrender in 1940. And they brought out the train, they had everybody there, but when Hitler became worried that the Allies in World War II might make Germany sign on the same car, the car was destroyed. So what Mel and I saw, my friend Mel and I saw, was a recreation. It was one of the actual cars from the train, but it had been done to look like that. So you notice Huns give up. Huns was a disparaging term for the Germans, okay? And I didn't mention this, but there was a weird thing, y'all. A few days before the actual armistice, there was what was known as the false armistice. Somebody somewhere thought they had heard that the war had ended, and they told everybody, and the papers published it. It was announced. People celebrated, were kissing and all that, and it was like, nope, false alarm, it wasn't really over. So when people did hear that it was over, it kind of wrecked it, because everybody's like, yeah, y'all said that a few days ago. Is it really over this time? And that kind of thing. And so anyway, here we see, one of the paintings and stuff of that, and people celebrated, y'all. This had been the worst, costliest in life, in blood and treasure, as people say, war in American history and in world history. Well, not in American, because the Civil War was worse for us technically, but it was the second worst for us. Little did we know about World War II, and of course, I can't tell y'all, but World War III is going to be even worse.
Oh, and yes, this is where this particular class ended yesterday. Now, the big thing that AP is going to ask you about there, big thing that AP is going to ask you about is about the fight over the World War I treaty, okay? Now, very, very important that you guys know what the 14 points were, because the peace, y'all, that was of World War I was to be based on these 14 points. Now, find those in your notes. And Wilson, a few months after we had entered the war, Wilson announced these points. And the idea was to let the Germans know that this would not be a really harsh peace like a lot of pieces had been, and hopefully get them to surrender early on. And remember, y'all, Wilson is an idealist. He thinks that he can figure out, as this progressive president, that he can figure out a way to stop future wars. Now, make sure in your notes you write down somewhere, because you guys know in AP they like you to make connections across eras. Compare this to the Atlantic Charter of World War II. And early on, before even the United States entered World War II, President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, y'all, met up in Newfoundland, and they wrote the Atlantic Charter and announced it. Now, the Atlantic Charter, y'all, was going to try to do the same thing. What are we fighting for? What do we hope to get out of this war? And both of them included a plan, a post-war plan for some international body to stop warfare. Now, of course, the World War I one, the World War II one, what would that be called, y'all? The international agreement to stop war after World War II. Well, not Treaty Versailles. What do we have today? It's like NATO, but much, much bigger. And it's, NATO is an alliance, right, against war. Y'all are the what? United Nations. Thank you. Did you say that, Janelle? Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought I was hearing it. All right, the United Nations. Okay, his version is going to be the League of Nations. Thank you. Yeah. Now, remember, and here's just a copy of it from his speeches. Now, the first thing that comes out of this is the idea of freedom of the seas. Remember, the Lusitania had been sunk. It wasn't an American ship. It was a British ship, but, Americans were killed. Wilson had this idea that you should not impair ships traveling back and forth. Trade was supposed to be free, right? Now, we don't mean, free stuff. By free trade, y'all, we mean no tariffs. There would be no tariff wars. And this would help minimize the chance of future wars. No more secret treaties between other countries. They had to be announced. One of the problems had been that the Italians, y'all, made a secret treaty with the French and the British to get some Austrian-Hungarian territory, which is why the Italians entered on the Allied side rather than the Central Power side. There's going to be a big movement after the war, y'all, and one of the things you guys will see in a video that I'll post that I talked about some of the weapons of the war is a lot of people, y'all, wanted disarmament. Okay, now in the 70s and 80s, we're going to see a big push for nuclear disarmament. What they wanted to do, y'all, was end the weapons like, massive bombers and planes. But the big thing, y'all, was naval ships, right? Getting rid of battleships and things like that. And the United States, despite not joining the League of Nations, the United States does cooperate in naval reduction. And this would be that body, the League of Nations, okay? Now, this is only really 5 or so of the points. Now, I'm going to let you see a weird video here, okay? This is a teacher by the name of Mr. Betts. Mr. Betts, those of you that were here yesterday, anybody after school, he does some pretty funny videos, but teaches really great stuff in them. And he's going to talk about the 14 points using 14 different shirts, or putting them on. So here we go.
14 points for Woodrow Wilson's plan for the post-war world. If you know what they actually were, today we're going to review them while wearing 14 shirts!
This should help you remember it.
Welcome back, class. Now, you remember World War I, right? No? Okay, here it is in a nutshell. Picture the worst club you can imagine. Everybody packing heat, wearing sleeveless flag t-shirts and pumping awful European dance music. Some random scuffs up some Austrian guy's Air Jordans and boom, a melee breaks out. Everybody's fighting because everybody has everybody else's back, and they're trying to settle a score from when their rivals stole their lunch money or their fertile land back in the 7th grade. And all the while, the U.S. is feeling lucky to have an ocean between them and this World Cup calamity. How would it last? See, the United States tried to remain neutral, uninvolved, and non-aligned with Europe's entangling alliances and imperialism. And remember, when the United States takes over new land, it's not imperialism, it's manifest destiny! But eventually, unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmerman Note, in which Germany told Mexico
so you're getting a good little review here
back from the U.S. if it became its Senora Frau, it kind of pushed then-President Woodrow Wilson's hand. Yes, this is the same Wilson that just won re-election with this slogan, "He kept us out of war." The guy that wrote that slogan is the same guy that called World War I the war to end all wars. So the U.S. entered the war, victory was on the horizon, and Woodrow Wilson gave his 14-point statement. Now, Wilson's 14 points given in January 1918 were unique because, well, Wilson was the only leader that openly stated what he hoped to get out of the war. Everybody else was like, just wait till we're through.
Well, really, remember the French, the British, they want revenge, they want territory.
Being another t-shirt.
They want reparations.
Open covenants of peace. Now, being at the intersection of a shady
That's
offer
the open treaties.
Into the war, a pledge for open diplomacy seems appropriate. Point 2, freedom of the seas. Again, what dragged us in? Point 3, the removal of economic trade barriers.
No trade barriers.
You're less likely to punch your customers in the face, usually. Point 4, disarmament. Now, leading up to the start of the war, everybody, especially Germany and England, were strapped like they were in an 80s action movie. In order to avoid a Chekhov's gun situation, Wilson wanted weapon levels lowered across the board. Point 5, the adjustment of colonial claims based on principles of self-determination.
Never forget.
That must have went over well in Europe. Now, points 6 through 13 were all about specific territorial issues. Point 6, Russia. The Germans will
now we'll look at a map and we'll see what was given up.
See how this Bolshevik thing turns out. This just in. Not very good. Point 7, Belgium and the evacuation of German troops from it. Point 8, France gives Alsace-Lorraine back from the Germans. France was still whining about it 50 years after the Franco-Prussian War. Point 9, Italy and the adjustments of its borders, mainly given it some of Austria-Hungary as a
which is why it joined in the first place.
Point 10, Austria-Hungary will continue to be an independent nation. Point 11, the Balkans. Just like countries like Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania.
Where the war started.
Their thing. Point 12, the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Turkish people can have their own country, but the non-Turkish people should have their own country. You know what?
Where you get divided up the Middle East.
Point 13, Poland. That's going to be a thing again. And finally, point 14, a League of Nations will be formed to protect the independence of all countries, big and small. So what did everybody think of these 14 points? On the surface, great. Wilson's idealistic peace without blame helped him win the Nobel Peace Prize, and many believe it persuaded Germans to seek the armistice, thinking that these would be the conditions of peace. Many Europeans saw them as a fair and easy way to just end the dang thing already. But some leaders had other plans. France's Prime Minister Clemenceau thought they were too idealistic, lovey-dovey, and arrogant. Easy for Wilson to say, being that he was the last one to join the World War Royal Rumble. That attitude led to the much harsher conditions in the Treaty of Versailles, conditions like war reparations, which would help fuel a future Führer's claim of betrayal. At home, the Republican Senate refused to approve any treaty that would have us join the League of Nations on basis of the whole entangling alliance thing, which means that we never even ratified the dramatically punitive Treaty of Versailles. Technically, we were still at war till 1921 when separate peace treaties were signed. Guess the last one in is the last one out. But what if a peace was made that truly followed the 14 points? Would totalitarianism and fascism take hold in Europe? Would decolonization still have to wait till halfway through the 20th century? Would the United States have been dragged back into an overseas war even sooner? Let me know what you think in the comments.
All right, so there you go, the 14 points. You probably won't forget them now after Mr. Betts there. So anyway, y'all, Woodrow Wilson, this becomes his baby, right? He is going to pledge his life, his reputation, everything, y'all, on getting this peace treaty done. Now, it's not like today when a president can hop on a plane and go over to Europe and be back in a day or so. Wilson had to go by ship. Ironically enough, the ship he went by was a ship that had been taken from the Germans when America went to war. They took over any German ships that were in our dock, and that was the ship he goes over there on. And this is the first time we've had a president leave the United States for an extended period of time and go to a completely another hemisphere. Y'all, he wanted to, sorry about the misspelling there, oversee. I guess I was thinking of going over the seas, but he wanted to oversee this peace process personally. This was too important a thing, y'all, to be left up to diplomats. Now, Wilson, y'all, was literally seen as a hero. This picture here really shows it well. People saw America and the president, y'all, as the country that had saved Europe, that had ended this war. And remember, American troops really did turn the tide. And Wilson comes over there, and I mean, they literally, y'all, they're throwing flowers in front of his feet. The kids are, right? That's kind of the hero he was. And like I said, he was very idealistic. And as Mr. Betts said, had we followed a lot of those things, maybe Hitler wouldn't have come to power. Maybe it would have been a very different post-war Germany. But Clemenceau, the French leader, who you'll see here in just a sec, and David Lloyd George, the British prime minister, those guys had other plans. They planned to punish Germany. Now remember, the French wanted revenge for the war in 1870. And everything they do, y'all, is going to be about payback to Germany for what they did. Lloyd George wants money and wants them to pay, he said, for every broken window, for every bullet shot, everything like that. So Wilson, y'all, is going to find it really, really hard going. Now, on your notes, I asked you who these guys are. If you just remember the big four, that's fine. Here's Woodrow Wilson here standing alone. That kind of tells you something, right? Over here, we see David Lloyd George, the British leader, talking to Clemenceau, who had been a teacher, by the way, and knew English about as well as anybody. And yeah, David is his first name. And this guy kind of standing by himself, y'all, that's Orlando. He is the leader of Italy, and he didn't speak English. And it turns out that Italy is not even considered a whole lot. Basically, the big four end up being really kind of the great 3.5, right? Now, remember, Wilson, y'all, he believes the League of Nations is the one thing he's got to save. He gives up point by point, y'all, on most of those 14 points. He gives up, he compromises, he lets them set up really, really high reparations. He gives up on this idea of ending a lot of the colonization, and we end up getting a very harsh peace. But he thought that was okay because he got them to agree to the League of Nations. And in his mind, y'all, the League of Nations would save everything. If we can just have a League of Nations, we can fix these problems down the way. Little does he know, he's not going to be able to get this to happen. Now, if you just remember the big four, right? The big four, and that's Wilson. And if you don't have to remember David Lloyd George and Clemenceau, but these four men, y'all, or like I said, 3 men. The fourth is Orlando. Think of Florida. Wilson, David Lloyd George, you see his name up there, and Clemenceau. You guys don't really have to know all those things. In World War II, there'll be the big 3, and that'll be, of course, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill as leaders. But think about it, y'all. These people have the world. They have the future of the world in their hands. I mean, imagine that. Now, Wilson, y'all, and Wilson is a stubborn guy. I mean, he's super smart. He's a college professor. He had written classic books on American history, on American political science, and yet he doesn't show a lot of common sense. Because what he does, y'all, is he only brings one Republican with him. Now, remember, he's a Democrat. Why is that a big deal? Well, in 1918, in the off-year elections, the midterm elections, Republicans had won the House and the Senate. And so he, a Democrat, is going to have to get a Democratic treaty through a Republican Senate. Now, you guys have heard the term ownership, right? You have to take ownership of something. You got to have some role in it. What if your parents were to come to you and say, hey, I've already picked your college. I got a great dorm room for you, and you're going to love the roommate I found for you. And hey, I got your major too. Well, you'd be like, do I have any say in this? Come on, you know, you're not going to be real happy. Now, if they sat down with you, of course, as long as they promise to pay, you wouldn't maybe mind it so much. So Republicans, y'all, are going to be basically given a Democratic treaty. They have no ownership. They have no influence on it. And as a result, they are going to turn it down. And you would think Wilson, with his obvious political knowledge, would have brought along some of these guys and gave them part of the goal of doing it. Now, he's gone a long time, y'all. He's gone for multiple months. Now, when the peace treaty is ultimately signed in mid-1919, and by the way, y'all, the treaty was so harsh that the Germans at one point considered walking out, okay? The Germans considered walking out, but the British, y'all, were keeping this blockade going on here and saying, look, we'll keep doing this until you sign it. We'll invade Germany, if necessary. And so Germany was forced to sign it under pressure. Hitler will use this, y'all, in coming to power. Now, the world you and I live in today, y'all, was greatly impacted by this treaty of 103 years ago. New countries are created. They literally get the map out, y'all, and redraw the map of Europe, and not in the best way. Now, one of the countries created, y'all, is right here, Poland, right? There you see Poland. Now, Poland had been a country once before, but remember, y'all, Russia, after having its two revolutions in 1917, Russia has a civil war. So Russia is in a mess, y'all, and various parts of Russia are going to seek their own independence. Poland is recognized as a country again, but there's a catch, y'all. If you look at this right here, do you see this little thing here that is between, that's right between Germany and Poland? This would become known as the Polish corridor. Now, Poland, as it was shown here, was a landlocked country. It had no access to the Baltic Sea. So what they did is they created an area here through which Poland could get to what was called the international city of Danzig, okay, today called Gdansk, and they could get through to there. But the trouble is, this splits Germany. Here is East Prussia, here's the rest of Germany. When World War II starts, y'all, that is going to be what Hitler's justification is. He's reuniting Germany. He's getting rid of this Polish corridor. So right there, y'all, they're setting one of the stages for World War II. The country of Czechoslovakia, shown right here, okay, is created out of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. Today, it is broken up into two countries, the Czech Republic, the Slovak Republic, or Slovakia. Kind of hard to see, I know, with that blue, but we get Yugoslavia. Now, Yugoslavia was also created out of the remains of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was to be a land of Slavs. That is, the Slavic people like the Russians. Today, of course, it's much more than that, right? Today, it's been broken up into 5, 6, 8, whoever's counting, because there's all kinds of disputes about what's a country and what's not.
Finland, Finland, Finland. The country where I want to be pony trekking.
There's Finland up here.
Or just watching TV.
All right, so I include that, y'all, because my wife is a Finnish background, so salute to them. Now, in World War II, y'all, Russia will try to get Finland back, right? And the Finns, at least for the first year or so, are going to back them off. Yeah, what's going on? Did you fix it? Okay, this is awesome. And it works? It works. Okay, that only took an hour?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to fill up with water again. It tastes better out of an Italian glass.
You can never open.
Oh, okay, good. Good job, y'all. All righty. Appreciate that. They just brought me a bottle that, that way I've been trying to get that fixed, y'all, here for a while. So good to know that my fellow teachers are much smarter than me. All right, but the thing is, y'all, in the news today, right? I mean, you've heard this discussion. You guys know we've talked a lot in class about the Ukrainian invasion. Remember, the Ukraine was not part of NATO. Many people believe that's one of the things that helped precipitate, at least that's what maybe people claim, the invasion was that they were considering possibly joining NATO, right? Okay, Finland and Sweden, y'all, have both also been neutral countries and not part of NATO. Seeing what happened to Ukraine, that wasn't part of NATO, they now are considering joining NATO. And of course, Putin has said, well, if you do that, I'll invade you too. But seeing how the Ukrainian thing isn't going so well, I don't know if that's that big a deal. But Finland, y'all, has always had a really difficult existence, being kind of between, those two places, and being part of Russia at one time. This is hard to see here. Iraq, IRAQ. Here it is. Now, Iraq, y'all, is drawn up also from the old Ottoman Empire, and Iraq, y'all, is made a British mandate. Not quite a colony, but British troops will be there. British troops will try to do it. But the trouble is, y'all, the people that drew up these borders, much like what happened with Africa in the 1880s and things, they don't really know the history, the ethnic problems, the religious issues. And Iraq, y'all, is a mess. And of course, it's going to lead to ultimately wars with its neighbor, at the time called Persia, today called Iran. And you have a large number of people of Persian or Iranian background living in Iraq. They would like to be part of Iran. And when they drew this up, y'all, they didn't really think about that. Transjordan, here you see Palestine, now modern Israel, the Lebanon, as they used to call it, and Syria. Now, all these states, y'all, are places where there are problems today. A lot of it due to these guys drawing up the maps and not doing such a great job. Now, up here, y'all, are the Baltic states. Now, these countries today are part of NATO. Now, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Now, they get their independence after World War I from Russia. But in one of the events that leads to World War II, in 1939, Hitler makes a deal with the Soviet leader Stalin to split Poland, but also the Germans will let him take Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania and won't say anything about that. So they go back to being Soviet, and for 50 years, y'all, they'll stay Soviet. Today, they're independent countries. But they are part of NATO, as I said. And, if Putin were to make a effort at any of these countries today, y'all, they're all part of NATO, and it would require that we help them. Number 7, as I said, Syria. Syria right here. That was under French control, as well as Lebanon. And these borders, y'all, really, really helped pave the way for the problems of World War II. These guys might have been ending World War I, but in a lot of ways, they were setting up the next generation for World War II, because you would see all kinds of ethnic fights. You still do to this day between various groups that are trapped in there. Yugoslavia, y'all, is going to explode into a terrible civil war in the 1990s. Some of the worst atrocities of the 20th century occurred right there. Okay. Oh, back? All right. Let you just see that. So ultimately, y'all, we're going to look at the ratification, as Cajun Man says, and we're going to see that it fails. We are not able to get this treaty passed. Okay. You good now? All right. Now, ratification. Yep, major fail sound. Now, I apologize for the small print on this. This is a very heavily text page here, y'all. But it is the League of Nations being included in the Treaty of Versailles that's going to lead to it not passing, y'all. Because basically, if you agreed to end the war against Germany, in the treaty, there was Article 10, right? Article X10. And it said, you are joining the League of Nations. All right. Now, as I said, the Republicans, Wilson's enemies, had majorities in both houses. They had won them in the 1918 midterm elections. Even though we were winning World War I, y'all, and World War I was days from ending, Americans rejected the Democrat Wilson and his party, and they put Republicans in control of both houses. Now, remember the man I told you that looked like the most interesting man in the world, Henry Cabot Lodge? This is the guy who leads the opposition. Now, the thing is, y'all, Wilson could have maybe saved this. But remember, Wilson is a stubborn man. He's already compromised everything except for the League of Nations. There's no more compromise left in this guy. Now, Henry Cabot Lodge says, look, Wilson, I'm willing to pass this treaty, but there are certain reservations I have, certain things that if you change it, I'll throw my support, my colleagues' support behind it. Of course, one of them was this League of Nations thing. Remember, his real fear is if we sign this, if we join this League of Nations, it might require us to go to war in some part of the world Americans can't even locate because we're part of it, okay? But there were other Republicans who were known as the irreconcilables. There was nothing that could be said to these people that would make them support the treaty. But the thing is, y'all, there were enough reservationists, which if added to the Democrats, could have got this treaty through the Senate. The irreconcilables, y'all, were in the minority. But together, if they both voted no, y'all, there was no way this treaty was going to pass. Now, Wilson, y'all, and he's not the best speaker in the world. He's not bad. But Wilson believes, y'all, that the American people can force their senators to change their mind. Now, much like President Truman in 1948 goes on this, train trip around the country and convinces people to vote for him, Wilson tries the same thing. Wilson hops on a train and he makes his way all over the country where he speaks directly to the people. Now, we call this going over the heads of the lawmakers. You're basically saying to them, you're saying to the people, you call, you write, you telegraph your senators. You let them know that you want this Treaty of Versailles. You want this League of Nations. Tell them you won't vote for them. You won't contribute money to them. Now, and of course, some people listen to it and put pressure on the senators, but not enough. And it's a great way, y'all, to get senators to hate your guts. So Wilson is making this trip, y'all, and he is busting his tail. He's talking every day for hours, and he's getting exhausted. And then one day in Pueblo, Colorado, he's up there giving a speech, and all of a sudden the train starts spinning around him, and the people start spinning on around him, and he collapses, okay? He just falls right over. They put him on a train. They go right back to Washington, D.C. I mean, all the way in Colorado, that's a long trip. When they get him back there, he has a severe stroke. And I mean, it's a bad one. He's not able to talk, not able to use his arm. It's a very, very debilitating stroke. And he never, to be honest, completely recovers. He'll be dead in 2 or 3 years after this. So this is what I mean, y'all. The guy literally gave his life trying to get this treaty passed. But ultimately, at least it failed. Now, this is a very interesting kind of topic, y'all. I think anyway, you guys know we've yet to have a woman president, sadly. But is that necessarily true? Because if you look at your notes, there's a picture there of a woman with Wilson. Now, this woman was his new wife, his first wife, who he owed a lot of getting elected to. She was an amazing artist, y'all, and gave up her impressionist art job to help her husband become governor of New Jersey and president of the United States, only to die not too long into his presidency. So he finds another wife, Edith Galt, okay? He marries her. Now, the thing is, y'all, I don't know if she didn't want the Senate to really see in how bad a shape Wilson was or not, but she basically became his intermediary. When senators came to talk about their problems with it, to seek Wilson to maybe modify it, to make compromises, she talked for them to him. She said, well, let me go talk to the president. I'll talk to him about that, and I'll let you know. And then, if things needed signing, I'll take it to the president. He'll sign it. Although I've heard stories that his signature looked a lot like hers. But anyway, so it is very possible, y'all, that indeed we did have a woman president for about a year, as Edith Wilson basically kind of fulfilled the role of her husband. Now, this experience, y'all, has led to what's called the 25th Amendment, right? Now, the 25th Amendment You heard some people talking about it with Trump. You may hear some people talking about it with Biden. I've heard grumbles of that kind of stuff too. But the thing is what do you do if you have a president who is not mentally all there? You have a president who is physically debilitated to the point they can't do their job, like Wilson was. Well, in the past, y'all, we just used to have to grin and bear it and hope it worked out okay. The 25th Amendment, y'all, allows for us to replace, if temporary necessarily, the president. Now, how does that go down? Basically, y'all, the cabinet has to look at it, and the cabinet, who's supposed to meet with the president frequently, makes a decision. Yep, president's in good shape. She can do their job. Okay. If on the other hand, they say no, this guy, this gal, not all there, elevator didn't go to the top floor anymore. We need to do something. Now, the president can disagree with that. And if so, it goes to the House, and the House investigates it and makes a decision. And the president, y'all, we can remove a president if we see that mentally and or physically they are unable to do the job. Now, and that's never been done, fortunately. But we have had presidents, y'all, who voluntarily gave up the presidency for hours or a day or so. Let's say they're undergoing surgery, right? They're undergoing something where they're going underneath the knife and they're going to have to get, put under for a while, right? Reagan did it. Bush did it. I don't know if Clinton ever had any surgeries. I don't think Obama ever did. But several different times that our presidents, y'all, were not able to do their job for a few hours or a couple of days. And can you imagine that? Like, your vice president, somebody says, you're president for the next couple of hours, dude. What you want to do, And so that's kind of fascinating. Now, ultimately, y'all, the treaty does not pass. Why? Well, Wilson's illness, his stubbornness, whatever, it fails to pass. And as a result, y'all, as you heard Mr. Betts say in his song, it takes until 1921, 2 more years, y'all, for us to make a separate peace treaty with Germany, with Austria-Hungary, with the Ottoman Empire, and all of that. And we never joined the League. Now, and because of this, y'all, and I know this is, let's just hear that again. Yeah, there we go. America never joins the League, and many historians claim this is why the League fails. Now, after World War II, the United States is going to be central to the creation of the United Nations. I mean, heck, the building is in New York City. We're the most important member, the biggest contributor to the United Nations. So did we maybe learn a lesson? I don't know. The League, y'all, it does do some good work. One of the things I hope to do if I ever get a chance to retire is work on a book on the League of Nations, because I think everybody only remembers its failures, and there were a lot of those. It failed to stop Hitler in Germany. It fails to stop Mussolini of Italy, and of course the Japanese in China. But it did do some things, and a lot of people don't remember that. It took me a long time to record that on my trombone. Back. I know that is a ridiculously busy screen. I usually don't put that much up there on one, so I apologize for that, y'all. Trust me, I went over that and I kept cutting and cutting. I should have spread it to 2 screens. All right, so in the next slide, y'all, we're going to look at the League of Nations. I'm going to show you its building, show you where it was located, and go over some of that with y'all. Okay, let me know when you're done.
That people basically think that he was the president for a year, right?
Well, a lot of historians have said that. I mean, I don't know really how clear his mind was. I don't know if you guys watch Breaking Bad or if you guys watched Don't Call Saul, but the character on there that's in the wheelchair and he has a little bell that he can hit, like, once for no, a couple times for yes or whatever. Or in the old Star Trek, Captain Pike, he can like 1 light, 2 lights, yes, no, kind of like that. I don't think Wilson could do a whole lot, and maybe it's been exaggerated, but she definitely played an important role in advising him. And the thing is, he probably couldn't dispute anything that she did, right? So she could come down and tell the guys or whatever. And I think she really didn't want them to see how bad a shape he was, or they might have demanded that, you know, the vice president take over or do something. What's his name? Henry Cabot Lodge, right? Yeah, and definitely remember him. He's on your star test, okay? Or he could be. He's listed in the teats to maybe be on your star test. All right, so there you go, okay? All right, so smaller slide, thank goodness. This is actually the symbol for the League of Nations. If you're old enough, it looks kind of like the Chrysler symbol. Now, what was the League? It's the predecessor to the United Nations. It's like, you know, United Nations 1.0. This is it on your notes? It may not even be there. I think I just left this to talk about. You don't have to write it down. Just watch. Now, it's supposed to settle the disputes between countries that lead to wars. Here's the building, which is still there today. It may be used, I think, by the United Nations. I'm not sure. I remember reading about it once. But that's where they met. Switzerland, remember? Supposed to be a neutral country, right? It's a good place for it to meet. But remember, we never joined. Why? That fear that it will drag us into a war for which we really have no reason to join. Now, remember, NATO is an alliance where you have to support each other. This isn't quite like that, but the idea behind it is if there is some aggressor somewhere, the different nations should maybe work together and be able to stop a particular aggressor. But the thing is, y'all, without the United States as, you know, big muscle, they would not really do that. They went ahead and let Hitler do all he wanted to. So their biggest failure, the League of Nations, y'all, is to stop World War II, right? They don't stop Hitler when he goes into the Rhineland, when he goes into Austria. They don't stop Mussolini when he goes into Ethiopia. They don't stop the Japanese in Manchuria or whatever. All they do is issue sanctions, you know, complain, but they don't send troops. They also tried to not sell oil or whatever to some of these places, but none of that worked very well. Now, here is the Treaty of Versailles. Separate little thing, just be aware of this. You don't have to write this down. It's signed a year after the war. This is a very, very famous painting. It's in a lot of the history textbooks. Now, as I said, y'all, there's a lot of psychology. There's a lot of revenge kind of attitude here. Now, when the Palace of Versailles, y'all, is an absolutely amazing building. I mean, imagine about 5 dobies, y'all, connected, and it being one person's home, right? The King of France. It was built by Louis XIV, I think the 15th and 16th, all of them. I think it kept going on. And the most remarkable room is the Hall of Mirrors. Imagine, y'all, almost a football field length kind of room, all right, filled with mirrors. So it looks like it's even bigger than it is. Now, in 1871, as France lost the war with Germany, or technically Prussia, the French had their nose rubbed in it by the Germans. The Germans insisted that the French sign the peace treaty right there. They insisted that the French recognize Germany right there. And so just like the railroad car that I've mentioned, the French decided, let's get some revenge here, and let's make the Germans sign this peace treaty right here. Now, it is very much, most historians believe, a harsh peace. It didn't do much of what Wilson had promised that this treaty would be based on. Germany lost all of its overseas colonies. Germany lost its territories, like, for example, in Africa and the Pacific. Germany itself, as you saw, was slightly divided with that Polish corridor. And one of the toughest things for Germany, y'all, is what are called reparations. Germany was asked to pay, I think it was like $33 billion in reparations. Now, that's a lot of money back then. Today, you know, that's like nothing. But that was a lot of money back then. And that is going to really hurt Germany after the war. Now, before you feel too sorry for Germany, however, when Germany had won the war against the French in 1871, they had made the French pay very high reparations. So once again, y'all, there's a lot of payback, literally, in this case. And so what you see is the Germans are given these high reparations. Now, this is going to cause all kinds of economic problems in post-war Germany. Germany's going to have to print lots of money. Germany's going to have to borrow money. The United States will borrow money, will loan them money so that Germany can pay France and Britain the reparations, so that France and Britain can then pay us back from for all the loans we gave them before we officially entered the war. So we're basically loaning money, y'all, to people to pay people who then pay us back. It was a crazy system. Now, as I said before, this treaty is never ratified because of its inclusion of the League of Nations. This is the actual treaty, what it looks like. And finally, okay, it helps lead Hitler to power, right? More than anything, y'all, Hitler capitalized on hatred of the Treaty of Versailles, this dictated peace. A lot of people wonder, how the heck could people have elected this guy? He didn't seize power, y'all. He was elected, okay? And he was elected popularly by the people because he promised to fix it. And we know how that worked out. Now, it didn't work out very well. So here's Hitler telling a joke, y'all. That's really not what he's saying in German, but that was on Monty Python, and I thought it was pretty funny. My dog has no nose. How does he smell? He smells terribly. All right, here. All right, so we're going to look at a map here, y'all, that shows World War I casualties. This is a bar graph here, okay? And we'll look at the first one. Russia, by far, y'all, lost the most people. And remember, Russia left the war early. They have a revolution, and they leave the war in January 1918. In World War II, they will also lose the most people, as many as 25 or 30 million people dead. Okay, now in World War I, their casualties, you got to remember, y'all, casualties include not just your dead, but also your wounded or you're missing. Sometimes people, y'all, they never find anything of a body or anything that they can identify, so you're just listed as missing. And then also people that are taken that are captured. Okay, so the Russians lost the most. Next most is going to be the Germans. Okay, about 7 million people or so the Germans lost in this war. I mean, those numbers, y'all, are just unbelievable. Y'all realize in World War II, we lost 300,000 Americans killed? This is just, in those countries, y'all, they don't have our population. This is why some people call it the lost generation, because, you know, it was hard to find a man, y'all, between the age of 20 and, say, 40 years old in the 1920s that wasn't wounded or mentally scarred in this war. There were a lot of women, y'all, who couldn't find husbands because there were so many more women than men alive as a result of this war. Then, of course, here we have Turkey. Surprisingly, Turkey or the Ottoman Empire lost a lot of people. Then here we have the French. The French lost around 6 million people, wounded, killed, or whatever. Incredible numbers, y'all, when you think of the size of their country. And then, of course, we have the British. British lost over 3 million people. The British, y'all, on one day, 54,000 men wounded or killed, okay? Almost 20,000 killed in a single day. July 1st, 1916, the Battle of the Somme. I was there for the 100th anniversary, y'all. Very, very sad date to remember. But imagine that. We lost about 3,000 people on 9/11. We have what? 4 or 5 times the number of people that country has in people. So imagine, y'all, losing everybody, say, in Pearland or everybody in Pasadena. Dead. That's just the dead, y'all, to give you an idea of the impact, okay, that this had, this lost generation. Then we have, I can't really tell, is that Italy? And then finally that's Turkey maybe down there. Okay, it was, the yellow up here was Austria-Hungary. Now that includes a lot of other places that are today independent countries. And then finally, y'all, we have the U.S. Sorry about the Austria-Hungary thing, and I thought that was awfully high for Turkey because Turkey was only in the war from 1915 on.
Now, my question for you is, so how many Americans died? Well, we'll see the actual number here in a little bit, but probably around 100,000 or so will have died in this war. And that's a lot. But, you know, think about it. That was for over 2 years of fighting. Now, why do you think we lost so few people compared to those others? Why did we lose so few people? What did we learn yesterday about when we got involved in this war? We got in late, exactly. We get in 1917, and to be honest, y'all, that's when we declared war. We didn't really get over there in large numbers until 1918. We start having Americans there in large numbers to turn the tide. So we weren't in the war as long, and yet this still had a big impact. My clarinet teacher, well, I'll talk about him later on, but when I talk about gas warfare, there's about 116,000 Americans who die in this war. There's a picture of the cemeteries. The cemeteries, y'all, I visited them, and you know what just breaks your heart? You're walking around and you see the birth dates of these kids, and I call them kids because a lot of them were born in 1898, the same year as my grandmother was, 1895. They're in their 20s. I found a kid, I think, that was 16 or 17 who had died. There were boys as young as 15 who fought, y'all. And you get their birth dates and their death dates. And, you know, you just walk around and you realize every one of those persons had a mother, a father, probably brothers and sisters. Maybe some were even old enough to have kids. And they're gone. Every one of those crosses represents one of those people. And I found this Texan. And I finally lost it, and I started crying when I, realized this a fellow Texan. He was very young, who had died fighting. Now, America's casualties were light compared to others, but America can really take credit, y'all, for having turned the tide and winning this war. It's almost like they're two boxers who are just fighting, and it's like 13 rounds, and they're just exhausted. That's like the British and the French versus the Germans, right? And they're just fighting. And the Russians eventually quit, and they keep on fighting. America, y'all, shows up. We're all fresh. We come in, we fight for a few months, and boom, knockout punch, and the war is over within a year of us getting involved. I mean, it was the number of weapons we had. It was how well equipped our troops were. Our troops were fitter and better fed in a lot of others than a lot of other countries, and we do turn the tide. Now, in World War II, we can definitely take credit for winning the war against Japan, but we have to share in World War II, y'all, a lot of the credit for defeating the Germans with the Russians and Soviets, right? They're the ones who take the most casualties. They kill the most Germans. They take the most territory. But definitely in World War I, we get a lot of credit for having turned the tide and winning that, okay? Now, so America's abandonment with isolationism would be, that's what I'm covering there. America's brief abandonment of isolation would be regretted and would have consequences. As you guys will see, when we sign, or when we try to get a peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, Americans were willing to sign a peace treaty, but if you sign the Treaty of Versailles, you also agreed to join the League of Nations. And to many Americans, y'all, joining the League of Nations would be like joining an alliance. It might require Americans to take orders from some non-American source and to have to go and fight somewhere else in the world. And Americans did not want to do that, okay? All righty. All right, the last thing to talk to y'all about here is the 1918 flu pandemic. And this is so weird for me to teach because the last time I really covered this, we had not had the pandemic, the corona apocalypse, as I like to call it, right? COVID. And I remember kind of laughing like, look at those people. They're wearing masks. Well, of course, we wore masks too. They didn't have theirs cover their nose, which was often a bad thing. But what happened, y'all, is we called this the Spanish flu, But what's weird is it didn't start in Spain. Spain was one of the first to admit that it had this happen. It started in America. We know it started at a base in Kansas. And when our soldiers got sick there, y'all, they hopped on boats, they hopped on ships, and they went to fight in Europe. And when they fought, y'all, what happened? They spread the disease to the other people. You know, they stopped off in England. They probably hung out with English women, went to pubs. They spread the disease there. Then, of course, when they captured soldiers, they spread it to them. Those soldiers went home. They spread it. And so it comes over from the United States. And since this is a world war and people are fighting all over, y'all, when those people go home, guess what? They bring the disease with them. If you visit old cemeteries, you would not believe the number of dead people from 1918, 1919. My dad lost one of his relatives that were in this. But you see this here. You see the police with masks on. You see nurses. Notice the nurses have their noses showing. Not really very good mask etiquette, I guess. And what was weird, y'all, when we think this killed anywhere between 50 million and 100 million people, that's just unbelievable numbers, y'all. That's like the population of the United States at the time. But this was a pandemic, not an epidemic, which is one country. Pandemic is across the world, as you guys all learned with the COVID pandemic that we recently had. Now, what was bad about this disease, y'all, unlike COVID, which tended to go after old people the worst, and people with co-mortalities like Mr. D, you know, issues, weight and diabetes and heart issues, this one went after young people. It went after healthy people. And it really desiccated the lungs. The lungs, y'all, just kind of dried up. I remember talking to a nurse who had survived it years and years ago. And she said she could never eat Rice Krispies again because y'all ever like pour milk on Rice Krispies? What sound do they make? Snack, crackle, pop. Because she said when they would turn people over, you could hear their lungs just kind of like that. It's just unbelievable how bad this all was, y'all. And it said, as if the war weren't enough, the Spanish, which actually came from the United States flu, killed even more people than the war did. And when the men came home, y'all, they brought the flu with them, the so-called Spanish flu. But really, it was more an American thing. Right,
one of the worst natural disasters in recorded history.
Documentary here called the flu pandemic that happened. You know, I know this is going to sound kind of weird, but lots of times people use humor as a way to handle something really badly. I mean, there's all kinds of jokes about terrible, terrible things that happen. And it's sort of our way of dealing with tragedy. It's been around as long as anybody. You guys probably remember from world history the fact that during the Black Death, the bubonic plague, way back in what, the 1400s, 1300s, you know, way back then, that kids used to sing a little song. They would join hands and they would dance around and sing, "Ring around the rosy, pockets full of posies, ashes, ashes," or sometimes tissue, a tissue, we all fall down. But what that song, how it originally was "Ring Around the Rosy." Rosie described this outbreak you would get on your neck when you got the plague. Pocket full of posies were the flowers that people kept in this mistaken idea that it could keep the disease away, or maybe to cover the smell of the dead. Ashes, ashes is what they used to say. Had to do with the burning of the bodies and all the ashes, or sometimes people said a tissue, meaning like sneezing, which was a sign that you had the plague. And they didn't used to say "we all fall down." They sang "we all fall dead." And it was a way, y'all, for people to deal with it. So quite a few years ago, my friend Greg Hinkle, and I knew Greg, y'all, from 7th grade. I know his brother, and this is Joe, and over here, you can't see it, Jay Lee over here, but they were in a band called the Flying Fish Sailors, and Greg was so clever. I say was because sadly, like a lot of Mr. D's friends now, Mr. D's getting old enough that I'm losing some of my friends, and so always keep your friends close, y'all. You never know when you might lose them. And Greg, incredibly talented man, wrote this song. about the flu pandemic. And I know it's going to sound crazy to have a song about so many million people die, but Greg loves studying World War I. He knew it as well as Mr. D and as any other person I know. And so Greg composed this little song about it. And I didn't get to see Greg during the pandemic, the recent pandemic, because, you know, we all were kind of supposed to be stuck in there. And sadly, he got sick and died just after the pandemic. And anyway, I did talk to him, and the irony that, you know, something that they kind of made fun of 100 years later in 2020 had become a reality again. So I'm going to play this song for you guys and just kind of let you hear it, okay? And turn down the volume on the one in the classroom here so it doesn't mess it up. I'm going to go ahead and put all the lyrics up for y'all to be able to see it. So here we go. Let's see them singing down All right, so anyway, folks, there you go. The Flying Fish Sailors, the flu pandemic, humor, dealing with terrible tragedy. But yeah, Greg was incredibly brilliant, and I'd miss my friend, y'all.